Will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions.
Unilateral sanctions.
Strong sanctions.
Sanctions at a very massive level.
Why is the US so keen on imposing sanctions? And who are actually being hit the worst by US sanctions? Without UN Security Council approval, the United States has unilaterally imposed economic sanctions on a range of countries. It has sought to act as the global arbiter by overriding international law, molding other countries and the world order according to its own purported values and political system.
Americans have even gone further than just ignoring the United Nations Charter.
Not only does the United States impose sanctions on other countries, it imposes its domestic laws on non-Americans or entities outside its jurisdiction in the name of upholding a so-called rules-based international order.
They now claim there's this, this phrase, this rules-based order. What do you mean rules-based order? What rules?
In a perverse extension of the principle of long-arm jurisdiction, the US has given cross-border primacy to its domestic laws and arbitrarily applied them abroad while ignoring international law. According to US domestic law, long-arm jurisdiction refers to jurisdiction over persons or entities domiciled or residing outside the territory of the sanctioning state. This was first established in 1945 by the US Supreme Court in the landmark decision of International Shoe Co. versus State of Washington. Long-arm jurisdiction allows state courts to exercise in personam jurisdiction in civil and commercial cases where jurisdiction cannot be exercised because the defendant is not domiciled in the state, on the basis that the defendant has some minimum contacts with the state. The minimum contacts rule is now being used by the US as the grounds upon which to exercise long-arm jurisdiction over an extraterritorial person or entity.
And international laws, to some extent, recognize a country in certain conditions may implement so-called long-arm jurisdiction. However, customary international has imposes a lot of disciplines upon the implementations of such long-arm jurisdiction.
According to international law, the exercise of a country's jurisdiction over an extraterritorial person or entity generally requires that the person or entity or its conduct has a real and sufficient connection to the country. Yet the US has chosen to also apply the minimum contacts rule when exercising long-arm jurisdiction, thereby constantly lowering the application threshold.
They always say that if you have an American company, an American person involved in any kind of situation, they can use the internal law to analyze the situation.
Only the US Congress can authorize the extraterritorial application of US domestic law. One way to achieve this is for Congress to include extraterritoriality when crafting legislative language. The US has enacted restrictive laws such as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, and the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. It has also issued a series of executive orders targeting specific countries, entities, or individuals. The US has also abused its domestic channels to exercise long-arm jurisdiction, with its federal courts free to interpret laws and its law enforcement agencies free to cherry-pick applicable legal provisions. The United States has become adept at prosecuting entities and individuals in other countries and even arresting and detaining non-Americans. In 2013, when Frédéric Pierucci, an executive at French industrial conglomerate Alstom, arrived at New York's JFK Airport, the FBI arrested and charged him under the infamous Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, for bribing Indonesian officials to win a power plant contract. The FCPA was born in 1977 to rein in corrupt practices in corporate America. It was a pioneering statute and the first law in the world to govern the conduct of citizens with foreign government officials in foreign markets. But later, the US government found that this disadvantaged US enterprises in overseas competition, so it made huge efforts in various ways to make the law international,
Told me that if you plead guilty, you're going to be released in 6 months.
Pierucci refused and was imprisoned for more than 2 years. He later found out that his arrest was part of a secret economic war that the United States was waging against certain European countries.
On the Alstom side, the clear goal was to buy out the company and to control basically all the nuclear power plants in France. Et ils m'ont arrêté pour faire pression sur le PDG d'Alstom. La menace était que comme j'avais été arrêté et que j'étais proche de lui, il savait très bien que la prochaine étape, c'était de l'arrêter lui-même. En m'arrêtant, ils ont mis la pression sur lui pour qu'il coopère, et donc pour qu'il accepte de payer une amende qui à l'époque était la plus grosse amende au titre de cette loi payée au Department of Justice, donc plus de 700 millions de dollars. Et ils ont mis la pression sur lui aussi pour qu'il vende.
Ultimately, Alstom was forced to pay a $772 million fine, the biggest financial penalty ever imposed by the United States. The company also relinquished control of its power generation subsidiary to General Electric, its biggest competitor in America.
Well, the American trap is basically the way the US is using the law as an economic weapon to weaken their competitors. For Alstom, you had several companies who went through this. You had Total, Technip, Alcatel, but every time the company managed to make a deal with the United States and sign a plea agreement and pay a big check. That did not make the headline. What was different about Alstom is that basically Alstom did not only pay a check, but then was basically sold out to General Electric.
It's just a question of leading technology. So they are abusing, they are using their legal law system to try, as we says, a long-arm justice, to try to input some problems with those companies, so our viewers can understand. So they use their internal jurisdiction and twisted some internal law to avoid competition.
According to documents released by the US Department of Justice, US-based companies were fined about $4.2 billion for FCPA violations between 2015 and 2022. While foreign domiciled companies paid 4 times as much, $17.3 billion, to resolve government investigations. Among the companies fined more than $50 million, 24 were based outside the US, while only 9 were domestic. The asymmetrical way in which the US treats domestic and foreign companies and citizens has raised questions about its intentions.
It's a bias because what they call corruption. The United States inside the country use that as a lobby. But when the countries, they try to lobby any industry, they say that it's corruption. So they apply a corruption act that is inside the United States, is not a value in other countries. That's a curious, I would say, measure that the United States has been taking to fight competition elsewhere.
One of the key reasons the US is able to apply its domestic anti-corruption laws overseas so effectively is the dollar-dominated international monetary system established after World War II.
I think the US has weaponized American dollar together with the international payment system known as the SWIFT system. Therefore, any company in the world, if it is doing business using US dollars, actually, it is under the supervision of the American authority.
5 years after the Alstom crackdown, the United States used a similar strategy against Huawei when its CFO, Meng Wanzhou, was arrested in Vancouver at Washington's behest on December 1st, 2018, in connection with sanctions against the Chinese telecom giant. The weapon used in this instance was US export control regulations targeting Iran. Any country or entity doing business with Iran can face secondary US sanctions.
Secondary sanction, I think, violates international law. First, it does not have any basis of the jurisdiction of international law. For example, it does not have support by either the territorial jurisdiction or personal jurisdiction. More importantly, it violates the international rule of non-intervention. The rule or principle of non-intervention is a very important international principle which is enshrined by the UN Charter, according to which every country has a right to conduct affairs without external interference.
It soon became clear that Meng's arrest was part of a larger plan to crack down on Huawei, a world leader in 5G technology, as then US President Donald Trump quickly leveraged the case in a tit-for-tat trade war with China that lasted for more than 2 years. By suffocating Huawei, the US government sought to weaken its 5G dominance while extracting more concessions in China-US trade negotiations.
Nowadays, US regard China as a competitor or a challenger to US interests. Therefore, it used its long-arm jurisdiction to penalize or to prevent the development of Huawei, which is a high-tech company of China.
After almost 3 years under house arrest in Canada, Meng Wanzhou was released in September 2021.
Over the past 3 years, my life has been turned upside down. It was a disruptive time for me as a mother, a wife, and a company executive. But I believe every cloud has a silver lining.
There is a very similarity in the way that the U.S. Department of Justice is approaching this. Basically, in order to put pressure on the company, they arrest or they indict somebody close to the top of the company. So what is happening to Mrs. Meng is very similar to what happened to me. Now, on the Huawei side, it's more to stop a competitor who has a big advantage in a unique technology, which is the 5G technology, which is the technology of the future.
In recent years, America's arms have been getting longer and longer. In fiscal 2021, the number of entities and individuals on US sanctions lists reached 9,421, a 933% increase over fiscal 2000. Professor Daniel Dresner of Tufts University has stated that America has become the United States of sanctions. So, why is the US increasingly imposing economic sanctions?
They like to say that they like competition, but when they are, I would say, they are threats in a good way, because this is not a war threat, it's a commercial threat, with someone that is more competitive than them. They try to raise sanctions. They try to create walls.
Initially adopted as a post-World War peacekeeping tool, economic sanctions have long been viewed as a non-violent strategy for deterring a host of threatening activities. But as they are more and more widely used by countries such as the US, they have ironically become hostile acts that now resemble a new form of warfare.
They create sanctions to stop companies, to stop sectors around the world, and that's what they have been doing with China for quite a long time, to protect themselves, because they are not real competitive in some sectors. We see that with semiconductors. We are seeing that with Chip 4, the alliance that the United States proposed with South Korea, with Japan, towards the semiconductors and chip industry to avoid competition.
According to American studies academic Manu Karuka, the United States has imposed 2/3 of the world's sanctions on more than 20 countries since the 1990s. Except for Antarctica, sanctions of the US cover every continent. US government economic sanctions imposed on Syria have caused countless civilian casualties, cut the Syrian people off from basic necessities, and blocked its economic development and reconstruction. Sanctions that make it illegal for many international pharmaceutical companies to sell medicine to Syria have led to chronic shortages of drugs and medical equipment.
القائمة تطول هنا، ولكن الواضح أن الهدف من هذا القانون هو في جوهره الضغط على الشعب السوري في لقمة عيشه وحياته اليومية ومحاولة خنقه في مشهد غير إنساني يذكرنا بذات الوحشية التي خنق بها جورج فلويد وآخرين في الولايات المتحدة.
The devastating earthquakes in February 2023 only increased Syria's suffering.
نمنا بالجامع 3 أيام ورجعنا على البيت ولا شباك كله يعني اتكسر وعم نموت من البرد. المعونات ما في ابدا ولا حدا اجى لعنا ولا حدا قالنا شو ناقصكم ولا شيء ابدا. والوضع كثير مأساوي.
UN Special Rapporteur Elena Duan recently visited Syria, where she reported that 90% of Syria's population lives below the poverty line. Limited access to food, water, electricity, adequate housing, fuel and medical supplies are direct results of the ongoing sanctions. Despite their magnitude, the Syrian sanctions are dwarfed by those imposed on Cuba, which has been under the boot of US sanctions for more than half a century.
Yo realmente pienso que se debería aflojar el embargo y terminar con el embargo que no ha tenido el objetivo, pero si afecta al Estado, al país, por lo tanto, me afecta de alguna manera u otra, me afecta a mí también. Afecta en el sentido que yo llevo en esta actividad 40 años y si ahora me veo limitado por recursos y por cosas y tengo ahora más edad, por supuesto que me va.
Realmente afecta la vida, ejemplo, el embargo o bloqueo, como se le quiera decir. Yo prefiero desde Cuba decir bloqueo, pero sin embargo realmente tiene una gran afectación en la vida de los cubanos en todo sentido. Cuando uno compra determinado producto y quiere pagarlo y hacer una transferencia, son muy pocos bancos en el mundo que acepten las transferencias que tengan origen de Cuba. El código SWIFT hay que ponerlo y cuando pones la palabra Cuba te cancelan esa operación.
In its 2020 report to the United Nations, Cuba stated that the embargo has cost the country $144 billion since its inception.
Que el gobierno de los Estados Unidos no tiene la menor autoridad ni legal, ni política, ni moral para andar sancionando gente por el mundo cuando se sabe que tiene una conducta bastante reprobable en materia de represión.
What's worse, in order to more effectively grant its domestic laws preeminence over international ones, the US has abandoned many key international institutions that it had previously championed.
美国在指责别人之前，应当先反躬自省。为什么美国要退出世卫组织？为什么美国要退出巴黎协定和伊朗核问题全面协议？谁是国际规则的破坏者？谁对国际秩序构成威胁？国际社会对此看得清清楚楚。
What worries me most, however, is the fact that the rules-based international order is being challenged. Quite surprisingly, not by the usual suspects, but by its main architect and guarantor, the US.